Back during the Yukon Gold Rush, plenty of Maritimers set off for Canada's far north in an effort to make their fortune. Some, though, found much more than they ever expected. I stumbled across this article in an old newspaper from 1898 signed George Black and the Golden Seven, written by some Maritimers updating their hometown newspaper about how their Yukon adventure searching for gold was going. Their tone was friendly and playful, and I read this and I thought, oh, this will make a nice fun story. There's no way this story will take any crazy, unexpected twists. So, I went to New Brunswick's provincial archives to search for more of these George Black and the Golden Seven letters. Found this giant box labeled George Black, and inside was not the letters. There was these notes inside from a poor researcher in the 1970s before computers searching for something. They were writing letters by hand, they were putting them in envelopes, putting stamps on them, and sending them to institutions all over Canada and the United States looking for George Black's unpublished memoirs. Figuring there was much more to this story than I thought, I took up the researcher's quest. It took me a little bit of work and a lot of phone calls to the Yukon, but I found George Black's unfinished memoirs. Turns out there was more to George Black's story than I thought. He still lived with his parents before he set off looking for gold. In the north, though, he became a somewhat morally dubious lawyer, and then he became a somewhat morally dubious politician. But then he went on to become one of the most powerful leaders in Canada, the Speaker of the House of Commons, which he resigned from after he was sent to an insane asylum after bringing a gun to Parliament and shooting rabbits from his office window. So much for a story with no crazy, unexpected twists.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
On March the 1st, 1898, the front page of Fredericton's Daily Gleaner newspaper blared.
Body of young men leave for Klondike.
According to the newspaper,
there was a large crowd at the station at 4:30 o'clock to bid the boys goodbye, and they were given a very hearty send-off.
Their destination was
the Golden Yukon.
Hundreds of New Brunswickers were caught up in gold rush fever that swept North America in 1898, heading to the Yukon to try and make their fortune. The leader of the Golden Seven was George Black, a 25-year-old lawyer who still lived with his parents. In his unpublished memoirs, George Black wrote,
"With a party of 7 New Brunswickers, I left Fredericton in March 1898 on a Monday morning. The day before, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I asked my mother to teach me to cook. My dear boy, she said, it couldn't be done in that short time, but warned me against using that unwholesome baking powder which would ruin a stomach. Poor mother, that stomach has probably digested hundreds of pounds of baking powder hotcakes with no evil effect, but a desire for more."
George Black was traveling with fellow New Brunswickers George Graham from Prince William, George Pinder from Temperance Vale, whose father was an MLA, George Amaro, who he called
the life of the party,
from Rishabukto, Samuel Hoskins,
the cook,
and Humphrey Boone from Fredericton. The youngest of their party was a 21-year-old Frederictonian named Walter Chestnut, who was a talented musician and whose brother Harry had just started the famous Chestnut Canoe Company. These young men, and George Black in particular, had all these dreams of immortalizing their trip for posterity. He wrote home all these vivid letters describing their adventure, and he copied these down in triplicate. He sent one copy to his parents, one to his friends, and the final copy was sent to the local newspaper, which I guess shows an early talent for self-promotion. The men boarding the train in Fredericton were joined by so many other New Brunswickers that they occupied an entire train car as they traveled all the way across Canada to British Columbia. When they reached Vancouver, they found all of the hotels were filled with gold seekers headed north. They head to camp
outside in the bush.
Vancouver's population was growing quickly. That bush they camped in would soon become Pacific Avenue. They discovered that finding a boat north was just as difficult as finding a hotel room in Vancouver. George Black wrote,
I traveled on a Chinese ship, the Ming Chao, loaded with horses, and had to sleep on the horse deck in an aroma never to be forgotten.
That ship docked in Wrangell, Alaska, where they received a rude welcome to the lawless early days of the gold rush.
Wrangell was the first Alaskan town in which we ran into professional gamblers. One was operating a shell game on a small table in the street. He had 3 walnut half shells and a little black ball. He manipulated the shells and players bet what shell the ball was under. One of our party bet $20 and won. He took the $20 gold piece and he left the game. As he walked away, he was joined by a stranger who complimented him on his good luck and told him there was another game he might beat. They started through an alley when the stranger stuck a 6-shooter in the player's back and demanded the $20. He got it.
They began the hike to Yukon, where they covered an incredible 93 miles on foot in only 3 days. It was at this point in the trip that they wrote that first letter I found to the local newspaper, which got me into researching this story. It was a very short, simple, and actually pretty sweet little update to their friends back home.
We are tenderfoot, but we keep our boots on and the soles of them are full of St. John River driving corks. We look tough and we are tough. You should see our whiskers grow. We use them to stick matches in.
They didn't find the trek terribly difficult, even with all of their equipment, but they were shocked at the prices that were being charged by boat pilots to cross every set of rapids they encountered.
Pilots were charging $150 a boat.
A couple members of the Golden Seven had worked in lumber camps in New Brunswick, so their solution was to simply cut trees, saw the boards up, construct a raft, and then cross the rivers on their own to avoid the pilot fees. Unlike most gold hunters who headed for Dawson City, the Golden Seven headed for Yukon's second city, Whitehorse. Or, I should say they headed to what they thought was Yukon's second city, because when they got there, they discovered
Whitehorse City had no buildings on it. There were a few tents on the side of the river, and it was in one of them, which operated as a saloon, that I had my first drink of whiskey, aged 25 years. That was my age, not the age of the whiskey.
The Golden Seven's big dreams of looking for gold did not go as planned. George Black's tale of looking for gold in particular is a very short story. After making that long cross-continental trek to the Yukon, he pretty much instantly decided that he hated being outdoors, bent over in an icy stream with a pan sifting through dirt in a hope of finding a little piece of gold. He wrote in his memoirs,
We expected to find gold everywhere, but we learned the hard way that finding a few colors of gold in a pan of gravel is far from finding any pay dirt.
Within only a few months of arriving in the Yukon, George Black got so annoyed with the whole thing that he abruptly quit the Golden Seven and he headed back to Dawson City. He didn't comment on the circumstances of his departure in his memoirs, just simply shrugging it off that
we could have made a fortune, but did not know enough about mining to do it.
The remaining members of the Golden Seven continued their quest for gold for about 2 more years. They never did hit it rich. Actually, their time in the Yukon was incredibly disillusioning. You see, how it works is the gold miners would buy the rights to dig on a little piece of land, which was called a claim. So these guys from the Maritimes, they had their claim and they dug around and around all over this land looking for gold for 2 years, and they didn't find anything. Their claim was a complete dud, which happened to a lot of people. But to make it so much worse, they watched as the crew working the claim right next to theirs discovered a massive deposit of gold worth $1 million. Then things got worse for the Golden Seven. Young Walter Chestnut, the talented musician whose brother was starting the Chestnut Canoe Company back in Fredericton, got sick and died. Walter Chestnut was buried on that dud claim in the Yukon, and the 5 remaining members of the Golden Seven went back to Fredericton. George Black, however, stayed in the Yukon. As far as I could figure out, I'm not actually sure that he ever went home, even to visit. This is going to be the end of the Gold Rush part of the story, but if you want to hear more about the Yukon Gold Rush, check out our other episode called The Real Klondike Kate. After George Black quit the Golden Seven, he set off alone back to Dawson City. At the time, he seemed to have been out of money because, in order to make it to Dawson, he needed to take a job working on a riverboat in order to pay his fare for his way there. When the riverboat made it to Dawson City, though,
it developed that the owners had no money to pay me or the rest of the crew.
Remember, despite all this mucking around looking for gold, George Black was actually a lawyer. Now, I, on the other hand, am definitely not a lawyer, and I don't know enough legal stuff to comment on whether or not what George Black did next was actually, legal? Or if it even makes any sense legally speaking, because this sounds really weird. I'm just gonna leave you with what George Black wrote himself, explaining what he did next in his own words, and I guess leave it up to you to decide for yourself what you think of it.
Having studied law in New Brunswick, a maritime province, I knew a smattering of admiralty law. Went to the courthouse, found Yukon to be an admiralty district and the sheriff of Yukon the marshal. I made out affidavits for myself and the rest of the crew and slapped liens on the boat and cargo. Other lawyers having judgments for creditors had the boat and cargo seized in civil court, but the admiralty liens took precedence. I took my pay half in cash and half in groceries.
He used his money he won to set up a little office and buy himself a tin sign that said,
George Black Law Office,
and set up an extremely unusual law practice renowned for using what might be politely called
unorthodox methods.
George Black had grown up in a well-to-do, respected, and genteel family in Fredericton. However, humans are products of their circumstances, and we can see a distinct change in him as he adapted to the rough and tumble life of Yukon during the Gold Rush. A large chunk of his unpublished memoirs are filled by George Black telling what he thought were humorous stories, and you can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes when I say humorous. These stories about his times as a Yukon lawyer are insane. I'm gonna tell you just one of them. So George Black is in court and he's defending a client
who was undoubtedly guilty and had planted a bomb in the woodpile of a man who had stolen his girl.
So in order to defend his client, who is facing charges of building a bomb, he decides to prove that his client is not guilty by having him build a bomb and set it off in court. His plan was to show his client was a bad bomb maker by having his client make a weak bomb, therefore proving to the jury that his client was not capable of building the actual big bomb used in the crime. So, George Black and his bomb maker client shows up to court to face charges of making a bomb with a bomb that his client made and a stove. In court, he puts the bomb in the stove, and just to prove to the court how confident he is that he is a bad bomb maker, the client goes and he sits on top of the stove. And then the bomb goes off in court, and it makes just a little bang. And then the jury sees this and they agree that clearly the bomb maker is bad at making bombs, and they decide that he is not guilty. As if the story wasn't ridiculous enough, at this point the judge gets super mad that the jury found the bomb maker not guilty, and he shouted at the bomb maker in court that he is a liar. And so, in court, the bomb maker snaps back at the judge.
I'd rather be a liar than a fool.
Again, I'm not claiming to be a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that every part of that story would be considered a real faux pas if he tried to pull it off in court today. Actually, that's one of the more normal stories he tells. On another one, there's a story of a judge that got so mad at a member of the jury who took off his boots in court, and the jurors' feet smelled so bad, the judge threw out the whole case. Another time, he was defending someone who was accused of making moonshine, and he got the case thrown out because the police drank the evidence. I want to emphasize here that even today, in the Yukon, George Black is actually a really big deal. Today there's buildings, there's parks, there's ferries, there's bridges and stuff named after him. He's an important figure, and it is definitely not for his career as a lawyer. It is because of George Black's career in politics. George Black wrote in these unpublished memoirs that he got into politics for the Conservative Party because he claimed that the Federal Liberal Party was corrupt.
The first federal election was in 1902 when the Liberal government's candidate was elected by gross fraud. Ballot boxes from polls where there were not more than 30 to 35 electors came into the returning officer at Dawson with over 200 ballots marked for the Liberal candidate and a poll book of fictitious names.
Wow, that's quite the allegation. Electoral fraud. That's serious stuff. But George Black is a lawyer, though, so I bet he filed some sort of fancy legal paperwork, possibly under admiralty law, and dealt with matters in court, right? Right? Well, no. He in fact opted to not go the legal route, and instead he used threats, violence, and angry mobs to get elected. But don't take my words for it, though. Let's let George Black tell this story himself.
We in the opposition determined to get copies of those lists of voters and, if necessary, use force to get them. Deputy returning officers refusing copies found themselves looking into the barrel of a 6-shooter or rifle. They made the copies. We decided to oust the crooked administration of the Yukon. A mob rushed the front door of the returning office. The custodian of the list rushed out the back door with his shoes in one hand and his necktie in the other, while the woman stood at her front door screaming, "Run, baby, run!" The enumerator took refuge at the RCMP barracks. There was a howling mob outside the police barracks. The police were in sympathy with us, and if violence broke out, he would be the first to be shot.
Okay, so that's a lot. Our young lawyer from Fredericton went on to lead angry mobs to political violence in the Yukon. It actually gets a bit worse, believe it or not, if you look at it in context. While George Black was justifying his actions by alleging the Liberals were corrupt, when I look closely at it, the Liberal Party's candidate actually has an ironclad alibi. He actually had a stroke while campaigning and was unable to leave his bed for the whole election. But what does George Black have to say about this? Well, a handwritten note at the bottom of this section of his memoirs concluded by simply declaring,
At the election the next day, the Conservative candidate was elected with a substantial majority.
It was shortly after this extremely ominous beginning in politics that George Black met an American woman from Chicago who had divorced her husband and gone to the Yukon to start a new life. Her name was Martha Munger, soon to become Martha Black after they got married, and she would become the brains behind his transformation from a riotous and chaotic local lawyer to a successful career politician. George Black went on to be elected as the Member of Parliament for Yukon for nearly 3 decades. He even rose to the position of Speaker of the House of Commons, making him one of the most powerful people in Canada. So you would think that he would have a lot to write in his memoirs about this, right? Well, no, as it turns out. Here is the complete total sum of everything he wrote in his entire 3-decade-long political career that he spent at the pinnacle Canadian of politics in his own words from his memoirs.
In 1921, I was first elected as a Conservative to represent Yukon in the Parliament of Canada. I was elected again in 1925, 26, 1930, 1940, and 1945. In 1935, I was ill, and the electors kindly elected Martha Black as their member from 1935 to 1940.
So that's quite the understatement. How big of an understatement? Well, when he said,
In 1935, I was ill.
what he meant was that he was sent to an insane asylum after bringing a .22 pistol into the Speaker's office in Parliament and pointing it out the window to shoot rabbits on Parliament Hill. Surely there must be some context to make this make sense. Unfortunately, George Black chose not to explain himself in his memoirs. This kind of leaves us to piece together this bizarre twist as best we can. I think we kind of have to take a look at what George Black stood for when he was elected. He went to great, terrible lengths to make it to the big political stage, so what did he use it for? George Black was a conservative. However, what he fought for would not be recognizable to most modern conservatives. And for that matter, he was actually often at odds with his own party back then too. He fought for policies including collective bargaining rights, setting up the first minimum wage laws, passing laws to regulate the maximum amounts of hours people could work. He fought for more paid holidays. He was a big advocate for the first unemployment insurance. He fought for representation of organized labor on government boards. He fought for the first old age pensions, the first workers' compensation, and for baby bonuses. His politics are pretty confusing though, to be blunt. All of those things I listed would be considered kind of socialist back then. But George Black hated socialists. He complained that they wanted to make people slaves to the government. But he was fighting for the exact same policies they advocated. It's really confusing. There was this one time there was a winter carnival in the Yukon and he had it banned because it was organized by a picnic and he called them all communists. So that's how much he hated socialists, but he was still fighting for these same policies. But this is during the Great Depression. His party was in power and these policies he was advocating were trying to help people. He was a household name conservative advocating for these popular policies, and I believe that's why he was promoted to the Speaker. However, his party didn't actually do anything to implement these policies, while millions of Canadians were suffering. It was said that George Black had a nervous breakdown. It seemed to have happened in the middle of 1934 when he was sent to an insane asylum, as they were called at the time, although the public wouldn't have heard anything about it until January 15th, 1935, when a letter was sent to the Prime Minister announcing his resignation as Speaker. By this point, it seems that George Black had already been inside an insane asylum in London, Ontario, for several months. His resignation didn't seem to be very heavily publicized or attract much attention, which is surprising for two reasons. First, he was the first ever Speaker in Canadian history to resign, and second, because he resigned so late before Parliament opened that it delayed the throne speech. 2 days after his resignation, though, Parliament finally opened, and the throne speech, in which the government outlines its priorities for that Parliament session, was read. In it, Prime Minister Richard Bennett announced that he was making dramatic changes and we were pursuing a series of reforms that George Black had long fought for, including unemployment insurance, health insurance, and working law reforms. And here's a not super fun fact. George Black continued New Brunswick's poor track record on speakers in the House of Commons. The first ever speaker from New Brunswick was Timothy Anglin, who got the boot for plain old corruption, while the second, and most recent, the last ever speaker from our province was George Black, who ended up in an insane asylum. With George in the asylum, there was an election for a seat in the Yukon. Remember when I said that his wife Martha was the brains of the family? Well, now she became the face. Martha ran for Member of Parliament representing Yukon in his place. At this point in history, only one woman had ever been elected MP before, Agnes MacPhail, who was with the party that is now the NDP. Agnes MacPhail, though, she won in Toronto, which, logistically speaking, is a lot easier to travel around in during an election campaign. Martha Black would have to run a very different campaign if she wanted to become the second woman ever elected in Canada. Martha wrote in her memoirs, which were called My 90 Years,
My campaign was different from any other in Canada. There were only 1,805 registered voters in a territory of over 200,000 square miles. There were no radio broadcasting stations. To reach voters, I had to travel by plane, row and motorboat, steamer, two-horse team, and the old reliable Shanks mare.
Martha Black won, becoming the second woman ever elected in Canada. Perhaps her most remarkable contribution while in office was that her relentless advocacy of the Alaska Highway linking that state to the American mainland through Canada was constructed, and it was a groundbreaking engineering accomplishment of its day. After 6 months in the lunatic asylum, George Black was pronounced cured. He returned to the Yukon where, 5 years later, he replaced Martha on the ballot, launching an astonishing political comeback. He was re-elected, and he served for MP for 9 more years. Martha Black, meanwhile, spun her time in Parliament into a lucrative speaking career. She became a popular and well-paid lecturer who traveled all over Canada, the United States, and England. She became a noted international expert on everything from art, letters, science, and politics. While George did return to politics and he won more elections, he was considered somewhat disgraced, and he spent the rest of his career as a backbench MP. Martha, meanwhile, grew into become an important national figure in Canada in her own right, and was ultimately awarded the Order of the British Empire. Both George and Martha lived into their 90s, and in Yukon, the two of them remain, to this day, important and well-remembered figures.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard.
Martha Black, voiced by Shauna Chase.
Produced by Jordan Lozier.